Jack the Ripper, The True Story, a comprehensive factual account of Victorian London's most notorious serial killer, written by Christopher Allen, narrated by Christopher Allen, music by Christopher Allen.
Oh, you look so drained, your eyes like rain, falling heavy on this midnight lane. Crash into my arms like a wayward storm. I want you here where it's safe and warm. You hesitate, but your silence speaks a language deeper than words can reach. I know your steps, I know your pace. Follow me now to a hidden place. The knife cuts deep, the night runs cold, the streets are empty, the story unfolds. I'll hold your heart where shadows blend. Together we'll write how this darkness ends. Your breath is sharp like a broken sigh, the moon's reflection in your restless eye. I lead the way where the lamplight dies, a secret realm where no one pries. No maps, no rules, just whispers low in the quiet abyss where shadows grow. The path is narrow, the air so still, but I know your heart, I know your will. The knife cuts deep, the night runs cold, the streets are empty, the story unfolds. I'll hold your heart where shadows blend. Together we'll write how this darkness ends.
Jack the Ripper, The True Story, a comprehensive factual account of Victorian London's most notorious serial killer. Part 1 of 2, Table of Contents, Introduction and Historical Context. The murders, a chronological account. The investigation, police work and challenges, suspects and theories. The letters and media phenomenon. I. Introduction and Historical Context. The autumn of 1888, in London's East End, witnessed a series of brutal murders that would forever change the landscape of criminal investigation, media coverage, and public consciousness. Between August 31st and November 9th of that year, 5 women, all prostitutes, struggling to survive in the impoverished district of Whitechapel, were murdered in a manner so savage and methodical that it captured the attention of not just London, but the entire world. The killer, who came to be known as Jack the Ripper, was never caught, never identified, and never brought to justice, yet his legacy endures as perhaps the most famous unsolved case in criminal history. The story of Jack the Ripper cannot be understood without first examining the social, economic, and cultural conditions that created the environment in which these murders took place. Victorian London in 1888 was a city of stark contrasts, a metropolis that represented the pinnacle of British imperial power and industrial achievement, yet harboured within its boundaries some of the most desperate poverty and social degradation in the civilised world. The East End of London, and particularly the district of Whitechapel, had become a byword for urban decay, overcrowding and moral corruption in the minds of middle-class Victorians. Victorian London, a city of extremes. By 1888, London had grown to become the largest city in the world, with a population exceeding 4 million inhabitants. The rapid industrialisation of the 19th century had transformed Britain from a predominantly agricultural society into the world's first industrial nation, and London served as both the commercial heart of this transformation and the administrative centre of an empire that spanned the globe. The wealth generated by industry and imperial trade was evident in the grand boulevards of the West End, the magnificent public buildings of Westminster, and the comfortable suburban villas that housed the growing middle class. However, this prosperity was built upon a foundation of exploitation and inequality that created vast disparities in living conditions across the capital. While the wealthy enjoyed unprecedented luxury and comfort, the working classes were crowded into increasingly overcrowded and unsanitary districts in the East End, where they laboured in factories, docks and workshops for wages that barely provided subsistence. The doctrine of laissez-faire capitalism that dominated Victorian economic thinking meant that there was little government intervention to address these inequalities or to provide social safety nets for those who fell through the cracks of the economic system. The East End of London bore the brunt of these social problems. Originally a collection of separate parishes and hamlets outside the ancient city of London, the area had been gradually absorbed into the expanding metropolis as London's population exploded during the 19th century. The construction of the London docks in the early 1800s had brought employment opportunities to the area, but it had also attracted waves of immigrants and migrants seeking work, creating intense competition for jobs and housing. Immigration and social tension. The demographic composition of the East End in 1888 reflected the complex patterns of migration that characterised Victorian London. Since the 1840s, the area had received successive waves of Irish immigrants, fleeing poverty and famine in their homeland. These Irish migrants, predominantly Catholic in a Protestant nation, faced significant discrimination and were often blamed for crime, disorder, and the depression of wages. They were followed in the 1880s by Jewish refugees fleeing pogroms and persecution in the Russian Empire and other parts of Eastern Europe. The parish of Whitechapel, in particular, had become a focal point for this immigration. By 1888, the population of Whitechapel had swelled to approximately 80,000 inhabitants, making it one of the most densely populated areas in London. The influx of immigrants had created a complex ethnic and religious mosaic, but it had also generated significant social tensions. Native-born English workers resented the competition for jobs and housing, while established Jewish communities sometimes viewed the new arrivals with suspicion and concern about the impact on their own social standing. These tensions were exacerbated by the economic conditions of the 1880s, which saw periodic downturns and high unemployment. The Great Depression of 1873 to 1896, though less severe than the economic catastrophes of the 20th century, nonetheless created significant hardship for working-class families. In the East End, where employment was often casual and irregular, economic uncertainty was a constant feature of daily life. Living conditions in Whitechapel. The living conditions in Whitechapel in 1888 were among the worst in London, and contemporary observers frequently compared the area to a foreign country, or even to hell itself. The rapid population growth had far outpaced the development of adequate housing, sanitation and public services. Much of the housing stock consisted of old buildings that had been subdivided and subdivided again to accommodate as many tenants as possible, with little regard for health or safety. The most notorious form of accommodation in the area was the common lodging house, which provided basic shelter for those who could afford the nightly fee of 4p for a bed or 2p for the privilege of sleeping while leaning on a rope stretched across a room. According to Metropolitan Police estimates from October 1888, there were 233 common lodging houses in Whitechapel, accommodating approximately 8,500 people every night. These establishments were often overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and lacking in basic sanitation facilities. For those who could not even afford the modest fees charged by the lodging houses, the alternatives were even more desperate. Some slept rough in doorways, under railway arches, or in the numerous courts and alleys that honeycombed the district. Others sought shelter in the casual wards of the workhouse, where they could receive a night's accommodation and a meal in exchange for performing menial labour. The mortality statistics for the East End reflected these harsh living conditions. According to contemporary records, 55% of children born in the East End died before reaching their 5th birthday, a rate that was more than double that of more prosperous areas of London. Diseases such as tuberculosis, cholera and typhoid were endemic, while malnutrition and alcoholism took a heavy toll on the adult population. The economics of survival. In this environment of poverty and desperation, many women turned to prostitution as a means of survival. The economic opportunities available to working-class women in Victorian London were severely limited. Most employment open to women, such as domestic service, factory work, or needlework, paid wages that were insufficient to support an independent existence. For women who had lost their positions, been abandoned by their husbands, or fallen into alcoholism, prostitution often represented the only means of earning enough money to pay for food and shelter on a daily basis. The Metropolitan Police estimated that in October 1888 there were approximately 1,200 women working as prostitutes in Whitechapel, served by 62 brothels of various descriptions. However, these figures likely underestimated the true extent of casual prostitution in the area, as many women engaged in sex work only occasionally, or as a last resort when other means of earning money had failed. The women who would become known as the canonical victims of Jack the Ripper were typical of this population. They were not professional prostitutes in the modern sense, but rather women who had fallen into destitution and turned to casual sex work as a means of survival. Most were middle-aged, had been married at some point in their lives, and had children from whom they had become separated. All struggled with alcoholism, which was both a cause and a consequence of their desperate circumstances. Law and order in the East End. The maintenance of law and order in the East End presented significant challenges for the Victorian authorities. The Metropolitan Police, established in 1829 by Sir Robert Peel, had been designed primarily to deal with the relatively orderly middle-class districts of central London. The force was organised along military lines, with an emphasis on prevention rather than detection, and officers were expected to maintain order through their visible presence on the streets. However, the conditions in the East End tested the limits of this system. The maze of narrow streets, courts and alleys provided numerous hiding places for criminals, while the transient population made it difficult to establish the kind of community relationships that facilitated effective policing. The hostility of many residents towards the police, whom they viewed as representatives of an oppressive system, further complicated law enforcement efforts. The detective branch of the Metropolitan Police, known as the Criminal Investigation Department, CID, was a relatively recent innovation, having been established in 1878 following a series of scandals that had discredited the previous detective force. The CID was small, understaffed, and lacked many of the scientific tools that would later become standard in criminal investigation. Fingerprinting was not yet in use, photography was in its infancy, and forensic medicine was a primitive discipline. Social reform and political activism. The appalling conditions in the East End had not gone unnoticed by Victorian social reformers and political activists. Throughout the 1880s, a growing movement of philanthropists, religious leaders, and socialist organisers had been working to draw attention to the plight of the poor and to advocate for social and political reforms. Organisations such as the Salvation Army, founded by William Booth, had established missions in the East End to provide both spiritual guidance and practical assistance to the destitute. Settlement houses, such as Toynbee Hall in Whitechapel, brought middle-class university graduates into direct contact with the poor, fostering a new understanding of social problems and potential solutions. The political landscape was also changing with the emergence of new socialist and labour organisations that challenged the prevailing orthodoxies of Victorian capitalism. The Social Democratic Federation, founded in 1881, and the Fabian Society, established in 1884, were among the groups that advocated for fundamental changes to the economic and social system. These reform movements had begun to achieve some success by 1888. The Third Reform Act of 1884 had extended the franchise to most working-class men, while the Redistribution Act of 1885 had created new parliamentary constituencies that gave greater representation to urban areas. However, the pace of change was slow, and the immediate problems of poverty, overcrowding, and social deprivation remained largely unaddressed. The stage set for terror, it was into this volatile mixture of poverty, immigration, social tension, and political ferment that Jack the Ripper emerged in the autumn of 1888. The conditions that had created the desperate circumstances of his victims, the economic inequality, the inadequate housing, the limited opportunities for women, the prevalence of alcoholism and prostitution, also created an environment in which a predatory killer could operate with relative impunity. The narrow, poorly lit streets of Whitechapel provided cover for criminal activity, while the transient population meant that strangers attracted little attention. The victims themselves, as marginalised women engaged in illegal activity, were unlikely to be missed quickly or to receive immediate police attention when they disappeared. The limitations of Victorian policing and forensic science meant that even when the murders were discovered, the investigation would face enormous challenges in identifying and apprehending the perpetrator. Moreover, the social attitudes of the time meant that the murders would be interpreted through the lens of Victorian moral and social prejudices. The fact that the victims were prostitutes led many to view the crimes as a form of divine retribution, or as the inevitable consequence of moral degradation. The involvement of immigrants in the East End community would fuel xenophobic theories about foreign criminals, while the sensationalist press would exploit public fears and prejudices to sell newspapers. The Jack the Ripper murders thus represented more than simply a series of criminal acts. They became a focal point for all the anxieties, tensions, and contradictions of late Victorian society. The killer's ability to evade capture despite the intense police investigation and media attention would expose the limitations of the existing social and political order, while the public fascination with the case would reveal the dark undercurrents of violence and sexuality that lay beneath the respectable surface of Victorian civilization. As we turn to examine the murders themselves, it is important to keep this broader context in mind. The 5 women who died at the hands of Jack the Ripper were not simply random victims of a madman's violence. They were casualties of a social system that had failed to provide them with the basic necessities of life and had left them vulnerable to exploitation and harm. Their deaths would shock Victorian society, not only because of their brutality, but because they forced a confrontation with the uncomfortable realities of poverty, inequality, and social neglect that many preferred to ignore. The story of Jack the Ripper is thus not only a tale of murder and mystery, but also a window into the social history of late Victorian England, a society in transition, grappling with the consequences of rapid industrialization, urbanization, and social change. It is a story that continues to resonate today, not only because of the enduring mystery of the killer's identity, but because it illuminates timeless themes of social justice, human vulnerability, and the capacity for both evil and compassion in human nature. 2. The murders, a chronological account. The series of murders that would become known as the Jack the Ripper killings did not begin with a clear pattern or obvious connection. Rather, they emerged from the background of routine violence and crime that characterized life in the East End of London. It was only as the similarities between the crimes became apparent, and as the media began to link them together, that the concept of a single serial killer began to take shape in the public consciousness. The Metropolitan Police investigation ultimately included 11 murders in their official Whitechapel murders file, spanning from April 3, 1888 to February 13, 1891. However, modern criminologists and historians generally agree that only 5 of these murders, the so-called canonical 5, can be confidently attributed to the same perpetrator. These 5 murders, committed between August 31st and November 9th, 1888, display a consistent pattern of extreme violence, specific mutilation techniques, and escalating brutality that distinguishes them from the other crimes in the police files, the pre-canonical murders. Before examining the canonical 5 murders, it is important to understand the context provided by the earlier crimes that were initially linked to the Ripper investigation. These murders, while not generally attributed to Jack the Ripper by modern experts, played a crucial role in shaping public perception and police response to the later crimes. Emma Elizabeth Smith, the first victim in the files. The first murder included in the Whitechapel murders file was that of Emma Elizabeth Smith, a 45-year-old prostitute, who was attacked in the early hours of April 3, 1888. Smith had been working the streets around Osborne Street in Whitechapel when she was set upon by what she described as a gang of 2 or 3 men, one of whom she identified as a teenager. The attack on Smith was particularly brutal and appeared to be motivated by both robbery and sexual violence, and she was severely beaten about the face and head, receiving cuts to her ear and other injuries. Most horrifically, a blunt object, possibly a stick or a bottle, was forcibly inserted into her vagina, rupturing her peritoneum and causing internal injuries that would prove fatal. Despite her severe injuries, Smith managed to walk back to her lodging house at 18 Thrall Street, where she told other residents what had happened to her. She was taken to the London hospital, where she was able to provide a statement to the police before succumbing to peritonitis the following day. Her ability to describe her attackers and the circumstances of the assault clearly distinguished this crime from the later Ripper murders, where no victims survived to tell their stories. The murder of Emma Smith was initially treated by police as an example of the gang violence that plagued the East End. Such attacks on prostitutes were not uncommon, as these women were seen as easy targets for robbery and were often reluctant to report crimes to the police. The involvement of multiple attackers and the survival of the victim long enough to provide testimony were both inconsistent with the pattern that would later emerge in the canonical Ripper murders. However, Smith's murder would later be included in the Whitechapel murders file, as investigators sought to identify any possible connections between the various crimes against women in the area. The extreme nature of the sexual violence inflicted on Smith, particularly the use of an object to cause internal injuries, would be seen by some as a precursor to the mutilations that characterised the later murders. Martha Tabram, a bridge between patterns. The murder of Martha Tabram on August 7, 1888, represented a significant escalation in the violence being perpetrated against women in Whitechapel. Tabram, a 39-year-old prostitute who had been separated from her husband for several years, was found dead on a staircase landing in George Yard Buildings, a tenement block off Whitechapel High Street. The discovery of Tabram's body revealed the extent of the violence that had been inflicted upon her. She had suffered 39 separate stab wounds distributed across her throat, lungs, heart, liver, spleen, stomach, and abdomen. Additional wounds were found on her breasts and in her genital area. The sheer number and distribution of the wounds suggested a frenzied attack that went far beyond what would have been necessary to kill the victim. Medical examination of the wounds revealed that they had been inflicted with 2 different weapons. Most of the injuries appeared to have been caused by a penknife or similar small blade, but one wound to the chest showed evidence of having been made with a larger, stronger weapon, possibly a bayonet or dagger. All of the wounds appeared to have been inflicted by a right-handed attacker, and there was no evidence that Tabram had been sexually assaulted before her death. The murder of Martha Tabram marked several important departures from the pattern established by the attack on Emma Smith. Most significantly, Tabram was killed at the scene rather than surviving long enough to provide information about her attacker. The use of a knife rather than blunt force trauma also represented a change in the killer's methodology. However, the attack still lacked some of the distinctive features that would characterize the canonical Ripper murders, particularly the systematic mutilation of the abdomen and the removal of internal organs. The location of Tabram's murder was also significant. George Yard Buildings was a notorious tenement block that housed some of the poorest residents of Whitechapel. The building's multiple staircases and landings provided numerous secluded spots where crimes could be committed without immediate detection. The fact that Tabram's body was not discovered until several hours after her death, despite the relatively public location, demonstrated how the architecture and social conditions of the East End could facilitate criminal activity. Police investigation into Tabram's murder focused initially on the soldiers from the nearby Tower of London and Wellington Barracks, as the nature of some of the wounds suggested military weapons. Several soldiers were questioned, and identity parades were conducted, but no arrests were made. The investigation was hampered by the reluctance of witnesses to come forward and by the general atmosphere of mistrust between the local population and the police. The murder of Martha Tabram would later be linked to the Jack the Ripper case by some investigators and commentators who saw it as representing an escalation in the killer's methods. The extreme violence of the attack, the use of knives, and the targeting of a prostitute in the Whitechapel area all seemed to fit the emerging pattern. However, the differences in the wound patterns, particularly the absence of the systematic abdominal mutilation that would characterize the canonical murders, have led most modern experts to exclude Tabram from the definitive Ripper victim list. The canonical 5, the Ripper's signature crimes. The 5 murders that form the core of the Jack the Ripper case display a remarkable consistency in their execution, suggesting the work of a single individual with a specific and evolving methodology. These crimes, committed over a period of just 10 weeks, would establish the template for what the public and police came to recognize as the Ripper's distinctive signature. Mary Ann Nichols, the first canonical victim. The murder of Mary Ann Nichols on August 31st, 1888, marked the beginning of the canonical Jack the Ripper series and established many of the patterns that would characterize the subsequent crimes. Nichols, known to her friends and family as Polly, was a 43-year-old woman whose life had been marked by the kind of downward spiral that was all too common among the women of Whitechapel. Born Mary Ann Walker in 1845, she had married William Nichols, a machinist, in 1864, and the couple had 5 children together. However, the marriage was troubled by Mary Ann's drinking, and the couple separated in 1880. After the separation, Mary Ann's life became increasingly unstable. She worked briefly as a domestic servant in various positions, but was unable to maintain steady employment, largely due to her alcoholism. By the summer of 1888, Mary Ann was living in the common lodging houses of Spitalfields, moving between Wilmot's lodging house at 18 Thrall Street and the White House on Flower and Dean Street. These establishments provided basic accommodation for those who could afford the nightly fee of 4pence, but they offered little security or stability for their residents. On the night of August 30th, 1888, Mary Ann found herself without the money needed to secure a bed for the night. She had been drinking heavily and had spent what little money she had earned. When she was turned away from Wilmot's lodging house for lack of payment, she was reportedly in good spirits despite her circumstances. She was wearing a new bonnet that she was particularly proud of, and she told the deputy keeper of the lodging house, "I'll soon get my DOS money. See what a jolly bonnet I have now." The last confirmed sighting of Mary Ann alive was at approximately 2:30 a.m. on August 31st, when she encountered Emily Holland, a friend from the lodging house, at the corner of Osborne Street and Whitechapel Road. Mary Ann was heavily intoxicated and boasted to Holland that she had earned her lodging money 3 times over that evening, but had spent it all on drink. Holland, concerned about her friend's condition, tried to persuade her to return to the lodging house, but Mary Ann refused, saying she would find the money somehow. She was last seen walking unsteadily eastward along Whitechapel Road. At approximately 3:40 a.m., Charles Cross, a carman on his way to work, discovered what he initially thought was a tarpaulin lying in the gateway to a stable yard in Bucks Row, now Durward Street. Upon closer inspection, he realized it was the body of a woman. Cross was soon joined by Robert Paul, another workman, and together they examined the body briefly before continuing to work and reporting their discovery to the first police constable they encountered. Police Constable John Neal arrived at the scene at approximately 3:45 a.m. and immediately recognized that he was dealing with a murder. The woman's throat had been cut so severely that the wound extended from ear to ear, nearly severing the head from the body. The cut was so deep that it had severed the tissues down to the vertebrae. Neal summoned assistance and arranged for the body to be removed to the mortuary at the Whitechapel Workhouse Infirmary. It was only when the body was examined at the mortuary that the full extent of the violence became apparent. Inspector Spratling of J Division, who was conducting the initial examination, made the horrifying discovery that, in addition to the throat wound, the victim had suffered extensive abdominal injuries. A deep, jagged wound ran along the length of her abdomen, causing her bowels to protrude. Several other incisions had been made on both sides of the abdomen, all apparently inflicted with the same weapon and in a downward thrusting motion. The medical examination revealed that the abdominal wounds had been inflicted after death, suggesting that the killer had remained with the body for some time after cutting the victim's throat. This post-mortem mutilation would become one of the defining characteristics of the Jack the Ripper murders, distinguishing them from ordinary crimes of violence or robbery. The identification of the victim took place later that day, when Mary Ann's father, Edward Walker, was brought to the mortuary. The formal identification was a traumatic experience for the family, made more poignant by the arrival of Mary Ann's estranged husband, William Nichols. Despite their troubled relationship, William was visibly distressed by what he saw, reportedly saying to the corpse, "I forgive you, as you are, what you have been to me." The funeral of Mary Ann Nichols took place on September 6, 1888, amid great secrecy to avoid attracting morbid sightseers. The authorities employed various ruses to move the body from the mortuary to the undertaker's premises, including using the back entrance in Chapman's court, a location that would gain tragic significance just 2 days later when Annie Chapman was murdered in nearby Hanbury Street. The murder of Mary Ann Nichols established several key elements of what would become known as the Jack the Ripper pattern. The victim was a middle-aged prostitute working in the Whitechapel area, killed in the early hours of the morning in a secluded location. The method of killing, a deep cut to the throat, followed by post-mortem abdominal mutilation, would be repeated in the subsequent canonical murders. The killer had demonstrated both the ability to approach his victims without arousing suspicion and the knowledge and confidence to perform extensive mutilations in a relatively public location without being detected. Annie Chapman, escalation and precision. The murder of Annie Chapman on September 8, 1888, represented a significant escalation in both the brutality and the precision of the killer's methods. Chapman, known as Dark Annie, to her friends, was a 47-year-old woman whose life story bore many similarities to that of Mary Ann Nichols, but whose murder would reveal new and disturbing aspects of the killer's methodology. Born Eliza Ann Smith in 1841, she had married John Chapman, a coachman, in 1869. The couple had 3 children, but like many working-class families of the period, they struggled with poverty and alcoholism. John Chapman died in 1886, leaving Annie to fend for herself. She attempted to support herself through various means, including selling flowers and matches on the street, but increasingly turned to prostitution to survive. By September 1888, Annie was living in Crossingham's lodging house at 35 Dorset Street, one of the most notorious streets in Spitalfields. She was known to the other residents as a quiet woman who kept to herself, though she was also recognised as someone who would resort to prostitution when other means of earning. Money failed. On the night of September 7th, 1888, Annie was feeling unwell and had been unable to earn enough money for her lodging. She was turned away from Crossingham's for lack of payment, but told the deputy keeper that she would return with the money. She was last seen alive at approximately 5:30 a.m. on September 8th, standing outside 29 Hanbury Street in conversation with a man. The witness to this final sighting was Elizabeth Long, a resident of Church Row, who was on her way to Spitalfields Market. Long later testified that she had seen Annie talking to a man who appeared to be slightly taller than her, with dark hair and a brown deerstalker hat. The man was wearing a dark overcoat and appeared to be of shabby, genteel appearance. Long overheard part of their conversation, in which the man asked, "Will you?" and Annie replied, "Yes." At approximately 6 a.m., John Davis, an elderly resident of 29 Hanbury Street, went into the backyard of the building and discovered Annie Chapman's body lying between the steps leading to the back door and a wooden fence. The scene that confronted Davis was far more horrific than anything that had been witnessed in the previous murders. Annie's throat had been cut in a manner similar to Ann Nichols, with 2 deep incisions that had severed the major blood vessels and nearly decapitated her. However, the abdominal mutilations were far more extensive and systematic than those inflicted on Nichols. The killer had cut open Annie's abdomen entirely, removing sections of flesh and placing them on her shoulders. Her small intestines had been removed and placed above her right shoulder, while her uterus and sections of her bladder and vagina had been completely removed from the body. The precision and anatomical knowledge displayed in these mutilations led many observers to conclude that the killer possessed medical or surgical training. The organs had been removed cleanly and efficiently, suggesting familiarity with human anatomy. Moreover, the fact that these extensive mutilations had been performed in the confined space of a backyard, in daylight, and within hearing distance of the building's residents demonstrated remarkable confidence and skill on the part of the killer. The investigation into Annie Chapman's murder was more thorough than that conducted for Ann Nichols, partly because the crime scene was better preserved, and partly because the police were beginning to recognize the possibility of a connection between the murders. The backyard at 29 Hanbury Street was carefully examined, and several items were found that may have been left by the killer, including a leather apron and some pills that had apparently been arranged in a deliberate pattern near the body. The medical examination of Annie Chapman's body was conducted by Dr. George Bagster Phillips, the divisional police surgeon, who would become a key figure in the subsequent Ripper investigations. Phillips's detailed autopsy report provided crucial insights into the killer's methods and possible background. He noted that the mutilations had been performed with a sharp knife, probably with a blade at least 6 inches long, and that the killer had demonstrated considerable anatomical knowledge in the removal of the organs. Phillips also observed that the killer had taken considerable time with the mutilations, suggesting that he felt secure in his location and confident that he would not be interrupted. This was particularly significant, given that the murder had taken place in daylight in a relatively busy area. The backyard of 29 Hanbury Street was overlooked by several windows and was accessible to the residents of the building, yet the killer had been able to complete his work without detection. The murder of Annie Chapman marked a turning point in public awareness of the crimes. The increased brutality and the apparent medical knowledge of the killer captured the imagination of the press and the public in a way that the previous murders had not. Newspapers began to speculate about the identity and motives of the killer, and theories about his background and training proliferated. The location of the murder also had symbolic significance. Hanbury Street was in the heart of Spitalfields, an area that had become synonymous with poverty, immigration, and social problems. The fact that such a horrific crime could be committed in broad daylight in this area reinforced public perceptions about the lawlessness and danger of the East End. Elizabeth Stride, and Catherine Eddowes, the double event. The night of September the 30th, 1888, would become known in Ripper law as the double event, a night when 2 women were murdered within the space of an hour, apparently by the same killer. These murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes would provide crucial insights into the killer's methods and psychology, while also raising important questions about his motivations and state of mind. Elizabeth Stride, the interrupted murder. Elizabeth Stride, known as Long Liz due to her height, was a 45-year-old Swedish immigrant who had been living in London for over 20 years, born Elizabeth Gustafsdotter in 1843 in Torslanda, Sweden. She had emigrated to London in the 1860s and had worked as a domestic servant before marrying John Thomas Stride in 1869. The couple had operated a coffee shop together, but John died in 1884, leaving Elizabeth to support herself. Like the previous victims, Elizabeth had turned to prostitution as a means of survival, though she also worked occasionally as a seamstress and charwoman. She was living in a common lodging house at 32 Flower and Dean Street, and was known to the other residents as a quiet, well-mannered woman who spoke with a slight Swedish accent. On the evening of September 29th, Elizabeth had been seen in the Queen's Head public house on Commercial Street, where she was reportedly in good spirits, and had been drinking with friends. She left the pub at around 11 p.m. and was subsequently seen several times in the company of different men as she walked through the streets of Whitechapel. The most significant sighting occurred at approximately 12:45 a.m. on September 30th, when Police Constable William Smith observed Elizabeth talking to a man outside the gates of Dutfield's Yard on Burner Street. Smith later described the man as being about 28 years old, of medium height, with dark hair and a moustache. He was wearing a dark overcoat and a hard felt hat, and Smith noticed that he was carrying a package wrapped in newspaper. At approximately 1 a.m., Louis Dim Schutz, the steward of the International Working Men's Educational Club, which was located in Dutfield's Yard, returned from a day of selling jewellery at a market. As he drove his pony and cart into the yard, the pony shied away from something lying on the ground near the gates. Dim Schutz investigated and discovered the body of a woman lying on her side with her throat cut. The discovery of Elizabeth Stride's body revealed a crime that was both similar to and different from the previous Ripper murders. Her throat had been cut with a single deep incision that had severed the major blood vessels and caused rapid death. However, unlike the previous victims, Elizabeth had not been subjected to any abdominal mutilation. Her clothing was undisturbed, and there was no evidence of the systematic organ removal that had characterized the murders of Nichols and Chapman. This absence of mutilation led to the development of the interrupted murder theory, which suggested that the killer had been disturbed in his work by the approach of D.M. Schutz and had fled before he could complete his usual ritual. This theory was supported by the fact that the blood from Elizabeth's throat wound was still flowing when her body was discovered, indicating that the murder had occurred only minutes before. The location of the murder was also significant. Dutfield's Yard was the site of the International Working Men's Educational Club, a socialist organisation that attracted many Jewish immigrants and political radicals. The club had been holding a meeting on the night of the murder, and there were still members present in the building when the body was discovered. This led to speculation that the killer might have been motivated by anti-Semitic or political considerations, though no evidence was ever found to support these theories. Catherine Eddowes, the completed ritual. Less than an hour after the discovery of Elizabeth Stride's body, a second murder was committed approximately 1 mile away in Mitre Square in the City of London. The victim was Catherine Eddowes, a 46-year-old woman who had been arrested earlier that evening for drunkenness and had been released from Bishopsgate Police Station at 1 a.m. Catherine Eddowes, born Catherine Conway in 1842, had lived a life marked by poverty and instability. She had been in a long-term relationship with John Kelly, and the couple had been living together in a common lodging house at 55 Flower and Dean Street. On the day of her murder, Catherine had travelled to Bermondsey with Kelly to visit her daughter, but they had been unable to obtain any money and had returned to the East End that evening. After being released from police custody, Catherine was seen walking toward Mitre Square, apparently intending to return to her lodging house. At approximately 1:30 a.m., she was observed by 3 men leaving a public house in the company of a man who was described as being of medium height, with a fair complexion and moustache. This would be the last confirmed sighting of Catherine alive. At 1:44 a.m., Police Constable Edward Watkins discovered Catherine's body in the southwest corner of Mitre Square during his regular patrol. The scene that confronted him was the most horrific yet witnessed in the series of murders. Catherine's throat had been cut in the now familiar manner, but the abdominal mutilations were far more extensive than those inflicted on previous victims. The killer had opened Catherine's abdomen from the breastbone to the pelvis and had removed several organs, including her left kidney and most of her uterus. Her face had been severely mutilated, with cuts to her eyelids, nose, and cheeks. Most significantly, her earlobes had been cut, apparently fulfilling the threat made in the "Dear Boss" letter that had been received by the Central News Agency just days before. The precision and extent of the mutilations suggested that the killer had spent considerable time with the body, despite the fact that Mitre Square was patrolled by police constables every 15 minutes. The fact that P.C. Watkins had passed through the square at 1:30 a.m. and found nothing, only to discover the body 14 minutes later, indicated that the entire crime, including the approach to the victim, the murder and the extensive mutilations, had been completed in less than a quarter of an hour. The medical examination of Catherine Eddowes was conducted by Dr. Frederick Brown, the City of London police surgeon, who provided detailed observations about the killer's methods and possible background. Brown noted that the mutilations had been performed with considerable skill and anatomical knowledge, and that the killer had used a sharp-pointed knife with a blade at least 6 inches long. One of the most significant discoveries related to Catherine Eddowes' murder was made several hours later, when a piece of her blood-stained apron was found in the doorway of a tenement building in Goulston Street, about a third of a mile from Mitre Square. Above the apron, written in chalk on the wall, was a message that read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." This graffiti, known as the Goulston Street Graffito, became one of the most controversial pieces of evidence in the Ripper case. Some investigators believed it had been written by the killer, while others argued that it was unrelated to the murders. The message's anti-Semitic implications were particularly concerning, given the tensions between different ethnic communities in the East End, and Sir Charles Warren, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, ordered that it be erased before dawn to prevent potential riots. The double event of September 30th, 1888, marked a crucial turning point in the Jack the Ripper case. The apparent interruption of the first murder and the completion of the second suggested a killer who was both adaptable and determined to fulfill his ritualistic needs. The increased brutality of the mutilations inflicted on Catherine Eddowes combined with the apparent fulfillment of the threat made in the Dear Boss letter, created a sense of escalating danger and unpredictability that heightened public fear and media attention. Mary Jane Kelly, the final horror, the murder of Mary Jane Kelly on November 9, 1888, would prove to be the last of the canonical Jack the Ripper killings, and by far the most brutal. Kelly's death marked both the culmination of the killer's evolving methodology and, paradoxically, the end of the series that had terrorized London for over 2 months. Mary Jane Kelly was younger than the previous victims, probably around 25 years old, though her exact age and background remain subjects of debate among historians. She claimed to have been born in Ireland and to have lived in Wales before coming to London, but many details of her early life are uncertain. What is known is that she was living in a single room at 13 Miller's Court, a small courtyard off Dorset Street in Spitalfields, and that she was working as a prostitute to support herself. Kelly's living situation was somewhat different from that of the previous victims. Rather than staying in common lodging houses, she rented her own room, though she was significantly behind on her rent payments. The room, which measured only about 12 feet by 10 feet, contained basic furnishings, including a bed, a table, and a fireplace. It was accessed through a door that opened directly onto the courtyard, providing more privacy than the shared accommodations used by the other victims. On the evening of November 8th, Kelly had been seen drinking in various public houses in the area, including the 10 Bells on Commercial Street. She was reportedly in good spirits and was observed in the company of several different men throughout the evening. The last confirmed sighting of Kelly alive was at approximately 2 a.m. on November 9th, when she was seen returning to Miller's Court with a man described as being well dressed and carrying a black bag. At approximately 10:45 a.m. on November 9th, John Bowyer, who worked for Kelly's landlord, went to Miller's Court to collect the overdue rent. When Kelly did not respond to his knocking, Bowyer peered through a broken window pane and saw what he later described as flesh and blood scattered around the room. He immediately summoned the police and his employer, and within minutes the courtyard was filled with police officers and officials. The scene inside Kelly's room was so horrific that it shocked even the experienced police officers and medical personnel who had dealt with the previous murders. Kelly's body had been subjected to mutilations that went far beyond anything that had been inflicted on the previous victims. Her throat had been cut down to the spine, nearly severing her head from her body. Her abdomen had been opened entirely, and most of her internal organs had been removed and placed around the room. The killer had also mutilated Kelly's face beyond recognition, removing her nose, cheeks, and eyebrows. Her breasts had been cut off and placed on a table beside the bed, along with her nose and ears. Her heart was missing entirely and was never found. The extent of the mutilations suggested that the killer had spent several hours with the body, taking advantage of the privacy afforded by the indoor location to indulge his destructive impulses to their fullest extent. The medical examination of Kelly's remains was conducted by Dr. Thomas Bond, who had been brought in to provide an expert opinion on all of the Ripper murders. Bond's report described the mutilations in clinical detail and concluded that they had been performed by someone with considerable anatomical knowledge and surgical skill. However, he also noted that the extreme nature of the mutilations suggested a killer who was becoming increasingly frenzied and out of control. The investigation into Kelly's murder was the most thorough of any in the series, partly because the crime scene was better preserved, and partly because the police were now fully aware that they were dealing with a serial killer. The room was photographed extensively, providing some of the earliest crime scene photography in British criminal history. Witnesses were interviewed systematically, and a detailed reconstruction of Kelly's final hours was attempted. However, despite the increased investigative effort, the murder of Mary Jane Kelly provided no more concrete leads than the previous crimes. The killer had once again managed to approach his victim, commit his crime, and escape without being seen or leaving any identifiable evidence. The indoor location of the murder, while allowing for more extensive mutilations, also meant that there were fewer potential witnesses than in the previous cases. The murder of Mary Jane Kelly marked the end of the canonical Jack the Ripper series, though this was not immediately apparent to the police or the public at the time. The extreme brutality of Kelly's murder led many to expect that the killer would strike again, possibly with even greater violence. However, no subsequent murders displayed the distinctive characteristics of the Ripper crimes, leading to speculation that the killer had either died, been imprisoned for other crimes, or had left the area. The pattern emerges. The 5 canonical murders, when examined together, reveal a clear pattern of escalating violence and evolving methodology that distinguishes them from the other crimes in the Whitechapel murders file. All 5 victims were middle-aged women working as prostitutes in the Whitechapel area, killed in the early hours of the morning in secluded locations. All had their throats cut with deep, precise incisions that caused rapid death, followed by post-mortem abdominal mutilations that became increasingly extensive and systematic with each murder. The progression from Mary Ann Nichols to Mary Jane Kelly shows a killer who was learning and adapting his methods, becoming more confident and more brutal with each attack. The interrupted murder of Elizabeth Stride and the subsequent completion of his ritual with Catherine Eddowes demonstrated both the compulsive nature of his behaviour and his ability to adapt to unexpected circumstances. The killer's apparent anatomical knowledge, his ability to approach victims without arousing suspicion, and his skill at avoiding detection, despite operating in a heavily populated area, all suggested someone with specific training or experience. However, the increasingly frenzied nature of the mutilations, particularly in the case of Mary Jane Kelly, also suggested a deteriorating mental state that may have contributed to the end of the series. The Jack the Ripper murders thus represent not just a series of individual crimes, but a coherent pattern of behaviour that provides insights into the psychology and methodology of one of history's most notorious serial killers. The fact that this pattern emerged over such a short period of time and then apparently ended as abruptly as it had begun continues to fascinate criminologists and historians more than a century after the crimes were committed. 3. The investigation, police work and challenges. The investigation into the Jack the Ripper murders represented one of the most intensive and high-profile criminal investigations in Victorian Britain. The Metropolitan Police, supported by the City of London Police and various other agencies, deployed unprecedented resources in their attempt to identify and capture the killer. However, the investigation was hampered by the limitations of 19th century forensic science, the challenging social and physical environment of the East End, and the intense media scrutiny that both helped and hindered police efforts. The police response to the Ripper murders evolved significantly over the course of the investigation, reflecting both the escalating nature of the crimes and the growing public pressure for results. What began as a routine investigation into the murder of a prostitute in Whitechapel gradually transformed into a massive manhunt involving hundreds of officers, innovative investigative techniques, and unprecedented cooperation between different police forces. initial response and evolving theories. The police response to the early murders in the series reflected the prevailing assumptions about crime in the East End and the limited investigative resources available to Victorian law enforcement. When Mary Ann Nichols was found murdered in Bucks Row on August 31st, 1888, the initial police response was relatively routine. Such violent crimes, while shocking, were not entirely unprecedented in an area known for its poverty, violence, and social problems. The investigation into Nichols' murder was conducted by the local J Division of the Metropolitan Police, under the supervision of Inspector Joseph Helson. The initial theory was that the murder was the work of local criminals, possibly members of one of the gangs that were known to operate in the area. This high-rip gang theory, as it came to be known, suggested that the murder was connected to the ongoing problem of violence against prostitutes by organised criminal groups who extorted money from them. The gang theory seemed plausible given the context of East End crime. Prostitutes were known to be vulnerable to violence from both clients and criminals, who saw them as easy targets for robbery and extortion. The brutal nature of Nichols's murder could be explained as an example of gang violence that had escalated beyond the usual level of intimidation and assault. However, the murder of Annie Chapman on September 8th, 1888, forced a significant reassessment of this theory. The similarities between the two murders, the method of killing, the post-mortem mutilations, and the targeting of prostitutes in the same area, suggested a connection that went beyond coincidental gang violence. More importantly, the precision and apparent medical knowledge displayed in Chapman's mutilations suggested a killer with specific skills and knowledge that were unlikely to be found among the typical criminal gangs of the East End. By early September 1888, senior police officials had begun to consider the possibility that they were dealing with a single killer rather than random acts of gang violence, and this shift in thinking was influenced not only by the similarities between the crimes, but also by the recognition that the publicity and panic generated by the murders would likely have led gang members to inform on each other if they had been responsible. The appointment of Inspector Frederick Abberline to lead the investigation marked a crucial turning point in the police response. Abberline, who had been promoted out of the Whitechapel area in December 1887 after 14 years of service there, was recalled specifically because of his intimate knowledge of the local area and its criminal elements. His appointment reflected the police leadership's recognition that local knowledge and expertise would be essential to solving the case. Inspector Abberline and the investigation team. Frederick Abberline was 45 years old when he was assigned to lead the Jack the Ripper investigation, and he brought to the case a wealth of experience in both uniformed and detective work. Born in Blandford Forum, Dorset in 1843, Abberline had joined one of the Metropolitan Police in 1863 and had worked his way up through the ranks to become one of the force's most experienced detectives. Abberline's 14 years of service in the Whitechapel area had given him an unparalleled knowledge of the local geography, criminal networks, and social dynamics. He knew the maze of streets, courts, and alleys that made up the district, and he had developed relationships with informants and local residents that would prove invaluable in the investigation. His recall to the area was seen as a recognition that traditional detective work, based on local knowledge and personal relationships, would be more effective than the more centralized approaches that were beginning to emerge in other areas of police work. Working under Abberline were a team of experienced detectives and uniformed officers who were assigned specifically to the Ripper investigation. Detective Sergeants George Godley, Robert Sagar, and Stephen White were among the key figures who worked closely with Abberline in conducting interviews, following up leads, and coordinating the various aspects of the investigation. The investigation team also included medical experts who played a crucial role in analysing the evidence and developing theories about the killer's background and methods. Dr. George Bagster Phillips, the Divisional Police Surgeon for H Division, conducted the post-mortem examinations for several of the victims and provided detailed reports on the nature of the injuries and the possible weapons used. Dr. Thomas Bond, a consulting surgeon to A Division, was brought in to provide expert opinions on the medical aspects of the case and to develop what would now be recognised as an early form of criminal profiling. The coordination between different police forces also represented an innovation in Victorian law enforcement. The murder of Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square, which fell within the jurisdiction of the City of London Police, required unprecedented cooperation between the Metropolitan Police and the City Force. This cooperation was facilitated by the recognition that the crimes were likely the work of a single killer who did not respect jurisdictional boundaries, investigative methods, and techniques. The Jack the Ripper investigation employed a wide range of investigative techniques, some of which were innovative for their time. The police conducted extensive door-to-door inquiries in the areas where the murders had taken place, interviewing thousands of residents, shopkeepers, and workers in an attempt to identify potential witnesses or gather information about suspicious individuals. The scale of these inquiries was unprecedented in British criminal investigation. According to police records, more than 2,000 people were interviewed during the course of the investigation, with over 300 individuals subjected to detailed investigation as potential suspects. 80 people were actually detained in police custody for questioning, though none of these detentions resulted in charges related to the Ripper murders. The police also employed innovative surveillance techniques, including the use of plainclothes officers to patrol the streets of Whitechapel in an attempt to identify suspicious behaviour or to catch the killer in the act. Some officers were disguised as women in an attempt to attract the killer's attention, though this dangerous strategy was ultimately unsuccessful and was abandoned after concerns were raised about officer safety. The investigation made extensive use of witness testimony, though this proved to be one of the most challenging aspects of the case. The transient nature of the East End population, the reluctance of many residents to cooperate with police, and the poor lighting and confusing layout of the streets all made it difficult to obtain reliable witness accounts. Many of the witnesses who did come forward provided conflicting descriptions of suspicious individuals, making it difficult to develop a coherent picture of the killer's appearance or behaviour. Medical evidence played a crucial role in the investigation, with detailed post-mortem examinations providing insights into the killer's methods, possible background and psychological state. The precision of the mutilations and the apparent anatomical knowledge displayed by the killer led investigators to focus their attention on individuals with medical or surgical training. This led to extensive inquiries among medical students, doctors, and others with access to anatomical knowledge. The police also investigated the possibility that the killer was employed in one of the local slaughterhouses or butcher shops, as some experts argued that the mutilations could be explained by familiarity with animal anatomy rather than human medical knowledge. This line of inquiry led to interviews with numerous workers in the meat trade. though no concrete evidence was discovered to support this theory. Challenges and obstacles. The Jack the Ripper investigation faced numerous challenges that reflected both the limitations of Victorian policing and the specific difficulties presented by the East End environment. One of the most significant obstacles was the lack of forensic technology that would later become standard in criminal investigations. Fingerprinting was not yet in use by British police, photography was in its infancy, and there were no scientific methods for analysing blood, hair or other physical evidence. The crime scenes themselves presented significant challenges for investigators. The murders took place in poorly lit areas with limited access, making it difficult to preserve evidence or to conduct thorough examinations. The bodies were often moved before medical experts could examine them in situ, and the crime scenes were frequently contaminated by curious onlookers, police officers and others who had legitimate reasons to be present. The social environment of the East End also created obstacles for the investigation. The high level of poverty and transience in the area meant that potential witnesses were often difficult to locate and interview. Many residents were suspicious of police and reluctant to provide information, either because of their own involvement in illegal activities or because of a general mistrust of authority figures. The ethnic and religious diversity of the area created additional complications, particularly in relation to the Jewish immigrant community. The leather apron scare, which focused suspicion on John Peitzer, a Jewish boot finisher, demonstrated how ethnic prejudices could both generate false leads and create social tensions that interfered with the investigation. The anti-Semitic implications of some of the evidence, including the Goulston Street graffito, required careful handling to prevent community violence. The intense media attention that the case attracted created both opportunities and problems for the investigation. On one hand, the extensive newspaper coverage helped to generate public interest and encourage witnesses to come forward with information. On the other hand, the sensationalist reporting often included inaccurate information that confused the investigation and generated false leads. The media attention also created pressure on the police to produce results quickly, leading to hasty arrests and the pursuit of theories that were not well supported by evidence. The publication of details about the crimes and the investigation methods also potentially provided the killer with information that could help him avoid detection. The letter campaign and its impact. One of the most significant challenges faced by the investigation was the flood of letters that began arriving at police stations, newspaper offices, and other institutions after the Dear Boss letter was made public in October 1888. These letters, which purported to be from the killer, created an enormous burden for investigators who were required to read, analyse, and investigate each communication. The vast majority of these letters were obvious hoaxes written by individuals seeking attention or attempting to mislead the investigation. However, the police could not afford to ignore any of them, as there was always the possibility that one might contain genuine information from the killer. This led to the deployment of significant investigative resources in tracing the authors of the letters and determining their credibility. The letter campaign also had a significant psychological impact on both the investigation and the public. The apparent taunting of the police by the killer, or by hoaxers claiming to be the killer, created a sense that the authorities were being outwitted and humiliated. This perception was reinforced by the killer's apparent ability to continue committing murders despite the intensive police investigation. The From Hell letter, which was sent to George Lusk of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, along with what appeared to be half of a human kidney, represented a particular challenge for investigators. Unlike the obviously hoaxed Dear Boss letter, the From Hell letter and its accompanying organ seem to provide potential physical evidence.
Before the curtain rises on the next chapter, let your imagination rest for a while. Here is a musical space created just for your relaxation. Let yourself drift along with the melody, cast aside all thoughts, and simply enjoy the present moment.
That could be linked to the crimes. However, medical examination of the kidney proved inconclusive, and the letter's authenticity remains a subject of debate among historians and criminologists. Innovative approaches and early profiling, despite the limitations of Victorian investigative techniques, the Jack the Ripper case saw the development of several innovative approaches that would later become standard in criminal investigation. Dr. Thomas Bond's analysis of the murders, conducted at the request of the police, represented one of the earliest examples of what would now be recognized as criminal profiling. Bond's report, submitted in November 1888, analyzed the pattern of the murders and attempted to draw conclusions about the killer's background mental state and likely behavior. He concluded that the murders were the work of a single individual who was probably not a medical professional, despite the apparent anatomical knowledge displayed in the mutilations. Bond suggested that the killer was likely a man of solitary habits, possibly suffering from a form of mental illness that manifested in periodic violent episodes. The investigation also made use of early photographic techniques to document crime scenes. Jack the Ripper, The True Story, a comprehensive factual account of Victorian London's most notorious serial killer, Part 2 of 2, the role of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. The formation of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee in September 1888 represented both an expression of public frustration with the police investigation and an attempt to supplement official efforts with community-based initiatives. The committee, led by George Lusk, a local builder and vestryman, organised patrols of local volunteers who walked the streets of Whitechapel in an attempt to deter the killer and to provide assistance to the police. The Vigilance Committee's activities reflected the Victorian tradition of community self-help and the belief that local residents had both the right and the responsibility to participate in maintaining law and order. However, the committee's efforts also created complications for the official investigation, as the amateur detectives sometimes interfered with police work or pursued theories that were not supported by evidence. The committee's most significant contribution to the case was probably its role in receiving and publicising the From Hell letter and kidney. George Lusk's decision to make these items public helped to maintain media attention on the case, but it also contributed to the atmosphere of sensationalism and speculation that surrounded the investigation. International cooperation and consultation. The Jack the Ripper case also saw some of the earliest examples of international cooperation in criminal investigation. The police consulted with experts from other countries who had experience with similar crimes, and they investigated the possibility that the killer might be a foreign national who had committed similar crimes elsewhere. Particular attention was paid to the possibility that the killer might be connected to similar crimes that had occurred in other European cities. The police investigated reports of comparable murders in Paris, Berlin, and other major cities, though no definitive connections were established. The case also attracted the attention of criminologists and medical experts from around the world, who offered theories and advice based on their own experience and expertise. While much of this international input was not directly useful to the investigation, it helped to establish the case as a matter of international interest and concern. The investigation's legacy. Despite the enormous resources deployed and the innovative techniques employed, the Jack the Ripper investigation ultimately failed to identify or capture the killer. This failure was not due to any lack of effort or competence on the part of the investigators, but rather reflected the limitations of Victorian investigative techniques and the particular challenges presented by the case. The investigation did, however, establish several important precedents for future criminal investigations. The use of criminal profiling, crime scene photography, and systematic witness interviewing all became standard practices in later cases. The cooperation between different police forces and the involvement of medical experts in criminal investigation also represented important developments in law enforcement practice. The case also highlighted the need for improvements in forensic science and investigative techniques. The limitations revealed by the Ripper investigation contributed to the development of new approaches to criminal investigation, including the adoption of fingerprinting, improved crime scene preservation techniques, and more sophisticated methods of evidence analysis. Perhaps most importantly, the Jack the Ripper investigation demonstrated the complex relationship between criminal investigation, media coverage, and public opinion in modern society. The intense media attention that the case attracted both helped and hindered the investigation, and it established patterns of interaction between police, press, and public that continue to influence high-profile criminal cases today. The failure to solve the Jack the Ripper case also had a lasting impact on public confidence in law enforcement and on perceptions of crime and safety in urban areas. The image of a killer who could strike repeatedly and escape detection despite intensive police efforts became a powerful symbol of the limitations of official authority and the persistence of evil in modern society. The investigation into the Jack the Ripper murders thus represents not only a fascinating example of Victorian detective work, but also a crucial moment in the development of modern criminal investigation techniques and in the evolution of the relationship between crime, media, and society. The lessons learned from this investigation, both positive and negative, continue to influence criminal investigation and public policy more than a century after the crimes were committed. I4. Suspects and theories. The failure of the police investigation to identify Jack the Ripper has led to more than a century of speculation about the killer's identity. The number of individuals who have been proposed as suspects now exceeds 100, ranging from highly plausible candidates supported by substantial evidence to wildly improbable theories based on little more than imagination and sensationalism. This proliferation of suspects reflects both the enduring fascination with the case and the fundamental problem that the lack of conclusive evidence allows almost any theory to be maintained with some degree of plausibility. The suspects can be broadly categorized into several groups. Contemporary suspects who were investigated by the Victorian police, historical figures who were proposed as candidates by later researchers, and modern theories that have emerged from new interpretations of existing evidence or the discovery of previously unknown documents. Each category presents its own challenges and opportunities for evaluation, and each reflects the particular concerns and assumptions of the era in which the theories were developed. Contemporary police suspects. The Victorian police investigation focused on several categories of potential suspects, reflecting the prevailing theories about the type of person who might commit such crimes. These contemporary suspects are particularly significant because they were identified and investigated by officers who had direct access to the crime scenes, witnesses, and evidence that may no longer be available to modern researchers. The medical knowledge theory. One of the most persistent theories about Jack the Ripper's identity centered on the apparent medical or anatomical knowledge displayed in the mutilations. The precision with which organs were removed from several of the victims, particularly Annie Chapman and Catherine Eddowes, led many investigators to conclude that the killer must have had formal medical training or extensive experience with human anatomy. This theory led police to investigate medical students, qualified doctors, and others with access to anatomical knowledge. Particular attention was paid to individuals who had spent time in mental asylums, either as patients or as medical staff, as it was thought that such an environment might provide both the necessary anatomical knowledge and the psychological conditions that could lead to such extreme violence. The police conducted extensive inquiries among medical schools, hospitals, and private practices in London and the surrounding areas. They investigated the whereabouts of medical students during the times of the murders and looked into the backgrounds of doctors who had exhibited unusual behaviour or who had been dismissed from their positions for professional misconduct. However, these investigations proved largely fruitless. The movements and activities of medical students were generally well documented and accounted for, making it difficult for any of them to have committed the murders without detection. Similarly, qualified medical practitioners were typically well known in their communities and would have found it difficult to disappear for the extended periods that would have been necessary to commit the crimes and perform the mutilations. Dr. Thomas Bond, who conducted the most comprehensive medical analysis of the murders, ultimately concluded that the killer probably did not possess formal medical training. In his report, Bond argued that the mutilations, while extensive, did not demonstrate the kind of precise anatomical knowledge that would be expected from a trained medical professional. He suggested that the apparent skill displayed by the killer could be explained by practice and experience rather than formal education. The butcher theory. An alternative to the medical knowledge theory was the suggestion that the killer might be employed in the meat trade, where familiarity with animal anatomy and skill with knives would provide the necessary expertise for the mutilations. This theory was particularly appealing because it could explain the killer's apparent anatomical knowledge without requiring formal medical training, and because the East End contained numerous slaughterhouses, butcher shops, and meat markets, where such skills would be commonplace. The police conducted extensive investigations among workers in the meat trade, interviewing butchers, slaughtermen, and others who worked with knives and animal carcasses. They paid particular attention to individuals who had exhibited unusual behaviour, who had been dismissed from their employment for violence or other misconduct. These investigations were complicated by the transient nature of much employment in the meat trade, where workers often moved between different establishments and where employment records were often incomplete or non-existent. Many workers in the trade were also immigrants or members of marginalised communities who were reluctant to cooperate with police investigations. Despite the extensive nature of these inquiries, no concrete evidence was discovered to link any individual in the meat trade to the murders. The alibis of those investigated generally checked out, and no suspicious behaviour or evidence was discovered that would justify arrest or prosecution. The butcher theory also faced theoretical challenges from medical experts who argued that the skills required for animal slaughter were significantly different from those displayed in the Ripper murders. The precision and apparent anatomical knowledge shown in the removal of specific human organs suggested a familiarity with human rather than animal anatomy. Local resident theory. Throughout the investigation, police remained convinced that the killer was likely a local resident who was familiar with the maze of streets, courts, and alleys that made up the Whitechapel area. This theory was based on the killer's apparent ability to approach victims without arousing suspicion, to commit his crimes in locations that provided both privacy and escape routes, and to disappear quickly after each murder without being detected. The local resident theory led to extensive door-to-door inquiries and surveillance of individuals who lived or worked in the immediate vicinity of the murder sites. Police paid particular attention to men who lived alone, who exhibited unusual behaviour, or who had been seen in the area at suspicious times. This approach generated numerous leads and resulted in the investigation of hundreds of local residents. However, the transient nature of the East End population made it difficult to maintain comprehensive surveillance, and the general atmosphere of suspicion and fear made it challenging to distinguish between genuinely suspicious behaviour and the normal anxiety that the murders had generated throughout the community. The local resident theory was also complicated by the possibility that the killer might be someone who worked in the area but lived elsewhere, or who had legitimate reasons for being in Whitechapel during the early hours of the morning when the murders took place. The area's numerous markets, docks, and other commercial establishments meant that there were always people moving through the streets at all hours of the day and night. Major historical suspects. In the decades following the murders, researchers and writers have identified numerous historical figures as potential Jack the Ripper suspects. These theories are typically based on circumstantial evidence, coincidental timing, or psychological profiles that seem to match the presumed characteristics of the killer. While most of these theories lack conclusive proof, several have gained significant support and continue to be debated by researchers and enthusiasts. Aaron Kosminski has emerged as one of the most frequently cited suspects in modern discussions of the Jack the Ripper case. Kosminski was a Polish Jewish immigrant who lived in Whitechapel during the time of the murders and who was later committed to mental asylums, where he spent the remainder of his life. Kosminski was born in Poland around 1865 and immigrated to London with his family in the early 1880s. He worked as a hairdresser and lived with his family in various addresses in the Whitechapel area. According to asylum records, he began exhibiting signs of mental illness in the late 1880s, including auditory hallucinations, paranoid delusions, and increasingly erratic behaviour. The case for Kosminski as Jack the Ripper is based primarily on statements made by senior police officers years after the murders had ended. Sir Melville Macnaghten, who became Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police in 1889, wrote in a private memorandum in 1894 that the police had identified three main suspects, of whom Kosminski was one. Macnaghten described Kosminski as a Polish Jew and resident in Whitechapel, who had a great hatred of women, especially of the prostitute class, and had strong homicidal tendencies. More significantly, Sir Robert Anderson, who was Assistant Commissioner and head of the Criminal Investigation Department during the murders, wrote in his 1910 memoirs that the identity of Jack the Ripper was a definitely ascertained fact, and that the killer was a low-class Polish Jew. Anderson claimed that the suspect had been identified by a witness, but that prosecution had been impossible because the witness, who was also Jewish, had refused to testify against a fellow Jew. These statements by senior police officers have been interpreted by some researchers as referring to Aaron Kosminski, though neither Anderson nor MacNaughton explicitly named him in their published accounts. The theory gained additional support from the discovery of documents in the 1980s that showed Kosminski had indeed been under police surveillance and had been identified as a suspect during the original investigation. However, the case against Kosminski faces several significant challenges. The timeline of his mental deterioration, as recorded in asylum documents, suggests that his most severe symptoms did not manifest until after the murders had ended. There is no direct evidence linking him to any of the crime scenes, and no witnesses ever identified him as being present in the area during the times of the murders. The claims made by Anderson and MacNaughton have also been questioned by historians, who note that both men were writing years after the events and may have been influenced by subsequent developments or by their own assumptions and prejudices. The lack of contemporary documentation supporting their claims has led some researchers to conclude that their statements may reflect speculation rather than established fact. In recent years, the Kosminski theory has gained renewed attention due to claims about DNA evidence allegedly linking him to the murders. In 2014, businessman Russell Edwards published a book claiming that DNA analysis of a shawl supposedly belonging to Catherine Eddowes had identified Kosminski as the killer. However, these claims have been widely criticized by forensic experts who have questioned both the provenance of the shawl and the methodology used in the DNA analysis. Montague John Druitt was a barrister and school teacher who committed suicide in December 1888, shortly after the murder of Mary Jane Kelly. Druitt's death by drowning in the Thames, combined with the timing of his suicide and certain aspects of his background, have led some researchers to propose him as a strong candidate for Jack the Ripper. Druitt was born in 1857 into a middle-class family in Dorset. He was educated at Winchester College and New College, Oxford, where he obtained a degree in classics. After university, he was called to the bar and practiced as a barrister, though he appears to have had limited success in his legal career. To supplement his income, he worked as a schoolmaster at a boarding school in Blackheath. The case for Druitt as Jack the Ripper is based primarily on the timing of his suicide and on statements made by his family after his death. Druitt's body was found in the Thames on December 31st, 1888, but medical evidence suggested that he had been in the water for several weeks, placing his death sometime in early December, shortly after the Kelly murder. More significantly, documents discovered after Druitt's death suggested that his family believed he might have been responsible for the Whitechapel murders. A note found among his papers indicated that he feared he was going like mother, apparently referring to mental illness that ran in his family. His mother had been committed to a mental asylum in July 1888, and there were suggestions that other family members had also suffered from mental health problems. Sir Melville MacNaughton, in his 1894 memorandum, identified Druitt as the most likely suspect among the three men he considered. McNaghton described Druitt as a doctor of about 41 years of age and of fairly good family, who disappeared at the time of the Miller's Court murder and whose body was found floating in the Thames on the 31st of December, that is 7 weeks after that murder. However, McNaughton's description contained several factual errors. Druitt was a barrister, not a doctor, and he was 31, not 41, years old at the time of his death. These errors have led some researchers to question the reliability of McNaughton's information and to suggest that his identification of Druitt may have been based on incomplete or inaccurate information. The case against Druitt also faces the challenge that there is no direct evidence linking him to the Whitechapel area or to any of the victims. His work as a barrister and school teacher would have required him to maintain a respectable public persona that would have made it difficult for him to frequent the areas where the murders took place without attracting attention. Furthermore, the timing of Druitt's suicide, while suggestive, could be explained by factors unrelated to the murders. His apparent mental health problems, his limited success in his legal career, and the financial pressures he faced could all have contributed to his decision to take his own life. George Chapman, Severin Klasowski. George Chapman, whose real name was Severin Antonovich Klasowski, was a Polish immigrant who was executed in 1903 for the poisoning of 3 women. Chapman's case as a Jack the Ripper suspect is unique because he was a proven serial killer whose crimes occurred in London during a period that overlapped with the Ripper murders. Klasowski was born in Poland in 1865 and trained as a barber surgeon, a profession that would have given him some knowledge of human anatomy and experience with sharp instruments. He immigrated to London in the mid-1880s and worked as a hairdresser in the East End, living and working in areas close to where the Ripper murders took place. The case for Chapman as Jack the Ripper was most notably advocated by Inspector Frederick Abberline, who had led the original Ripper investigation. When Chapman was arrested for poisoning in 1902, Abberline reportedly told the arresting officer, "You've got Jack the Ripper at last." Abberline's endorsement of Chapman as a suspect carried significant weight, given his intimate knowledge of the original investigation. Several factors seem to support the Chapman theory. His presence in the Whitechapel area during the time of the murders, his anatomical knowledge from his barber surgeon training, and his proven capacity for serial murder all made him a plausible candidate. Additionally, the timing of the Ripper murders appeared to coincide with periods when Chapman was known to be in London, while the cessation of the murders could be explained by his temporary departure from the country. However, the Chapman theory faces significant challenges from criminological and psychological perspectives. The most fundamental problem is that Chapman's proven murders were committed using poison, a method that is completely different from the violent, hands-on approach used by Jack the Ripper. Modern criminal profiling suggests that serial killers rarely change their fundamental methods so dramatically. The psychological profiles of poisoners and violent killers also differ significantly. Poisoners are typically characterized as methodical, patient, and risk-averse individuals who prefer to maintain distance from their victims. In contrast, the Ripper murders suggest a killer who is impulsive, violent, and willing to take enormous risks to achieve direct physical contact with his victims. Furthermore, there is no direct evidence linking Chapman to any of the Ripper crime scenes or victims. Despite his presence in the East End during the relevant period, no witnesses ever identified him as being in the vicinity of the murders, and no physical evidence was ever discovered that connected him to the crimes. Dr. Francis Tumblety was an American quack doctor and self-proclaimed herb specialist who was in London during the time of the Ripper murders and who was actually arrested by police in connection with the case. Tumblety's arrest, his subsequent escape from Britain, and certain aspects of his background and behaviour have made him a significant suspect in modern discussions of the case. Tumblety was born in Ireland around 1833, but grew up in the United States, where he developed a career as a travelling medicine man and self-styled doctor. He had no formal medical training, but claimed to be an expert in herbal remedies and alternative medicine. His career was marked by numerous controversies, arrests and accusations of fraud and quackery. Tumblety arrived in London in 1888 and took lodgings in the East End, where he continued to practice his dubious medical arts. He was known to local police as a suspicious character, and his behaviour and appearance attracted attention from both authorities and local residents. The case for Tumblety, as Jack the Ripper, is based on several factors. He was arrested by London police in November 1888 on charges of gross indecency, a euphemism for homosexual activity, which was illegal under Victorian law. While in custody, he was also questioned about the Ripper murders, suggesting that police considered him a serious suspect. More significantly, Tumblety was known to have an intense hatred of women, particularly prostitutes. He reportedly kept a collection of preserved wombs in his lodgings, which he claimed to have obtained from medical sources, but which suggested a disturbing obsession with female anatomy. His misogynistic attitudes and his anatomical interests seemed to fit the profile of someone who might commit the type of crimes attributed to Jack the Ripper. Tumblety's behaviour after his arrest also seemed suspicious. He was released on bail in November 1888, but immediately fled the country, travelling first to France and then back to the United States. His hasty departure from Britain occurred shortly before the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, leading some to speculate that he had fled to avoid further police attention. American police documents discovered in the 1990s revealed that Scotland Yard had requested assistance in monitoring Tumblety's activities after his return to the United States, suggesting that British authorities continued to consider him a suspect even after he had left the country. However, the case against Tumblety also faces significant challenges. The charges on which he was arrested, gross indecency, were unrelated to the murders and would not have prevented him from being charged with the Ripper crimes if there had been sufficient evidence. His release on bail suggests that police did not consider the evidence against him to be particularly strong. The timeline of Tumblety's presence in London also presents problems for the theory. While he was certainly in the city during some of the murders, there is uncertainty about his exact whereabouts during all of the relevant dates. Some researchers have suggested that he may not have been in London during some of the earlier murders in the series. Furthermore, Tumblety's physical appearance and behaviour would have made him a conspicuous figure in the East End. He was described as a tall, flamboyantly dressed man with distinctive mannerisms who would have been easily remembered by witnesses. The fact that no witnesses ever identified him as being present at any of the crime scenes is problematic for the theory. Thomas Cutbush. Thomas Cutbush was a contemporary suspect who was investigated by police during the original Ripper investigation and who was later proposed as the killer in a series of newspaper articles published in 1894. Cutbush's case is significant because he was one of the few suspects who was actually detained and investigated by the Victorian police in connection with the murders. Cutbush was born in 1865 and worked as a medical student, though he appears to have been dismissed from his studies due to erratic behaviour and poor performance. He lived with his aunt and uncle in South London, but was known to frequent the East End, where he had been observed behaving suspiciously on several occasions. In 1891, Cutbush was arrested for stabbing 2 women in the buttocks with a knife in separate incidents in South London. These attacks, while not fatal, bore some similarities to the Ripper murders in their targeting of women and the use of a knife. Cutbush was found to be insane and was committed to Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum, where he remained for the rest of his life. The case for Cutbush as Jack the Ripper was most notably advanced by the Sun newspaper in 1894, which published a series of articles claiming that he was the Whitechapel murderer. The newspaper's theory was based on Cutbush's medical background, his presence in the East End during the time of the murders, and his subsequent attacks on women with a knife. The Sun's articles prompted an official response from the Metropolitan Police, who issued a statement denying that Cutbush was a serious suspect in the Ripper case. However, the discovery of police documents in later years revealed that Cutbush had indeed been investigated in connection with the murders, and that some officers had considered him a viable suspect. Sir Melville Macnaghten's 1894 memorandum, which was written partly in response to the Sun's articles, acknowledged that Cutbush had been investigated but argued that he was not a serious suspect. Macnaghten noted that Cutbush's attacks on women had occurred after the Ripper murders had ended, and that there was no evidence linking him to the earlier crimes. However, some modern researchers have argued that Macnaghten's dismissal of Cutbush may have been premature. They point to evidence that Cutbush's mental illness may have manifested earlier than officially recorded, and that his presence in the East End during the relevant period has not been adequately investigated. The case against Cutbush includes the lack of direct evidence linking him to any of the Ripper crime scenes, and the differences between his proven attacks and the Ripper murders. Cutbush's attacks were non-fatal stabbings that did not involve the extensive mutilations that characterized the canonical Ripper crimes, royal and conspiracy theories. The Jack the Ripper case has also generated numerous conspiracy theories involving members of the British royal family, government officials, and secret societies. These theories, while generally lacking in credible evidence, have captured public imagination and have been the subject of numerous books, films, and television programs. The Royal Conspiracy Theory. The most famous of the royal conspiracy theories involves Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, who was the eldest son of the future King Edward VII and second in line to the throne. This theory, which was first proposed in the 1970s, suggests that the prince was either Jack the Ripper himself or was involved in a cover-up of the murders. The theory is based on claims that Prince Albert Victor had secretly married a Catholic woman named Annie Crook and had fathered a child with her. According to this version of events, the Ripper murders were committed to eliminate witnesses to this secret marriage, which would have created a constitutional crisis if it had become public knowledge. However, this theory has been thoroughly debunked by historians who have demonstrated that Prince Albert Victor was not in London during most of the Ripper murders. Royal records show that he was fulfilling official duties in other parts of the country during the times when several of the murders took place, making it impossible for him to have been directly involved in the crimes. The theory also lacks any credible evidence for the alleged secret marriage or for the involvement of government officials in a cover-up. The claims about Annie Crook and the supposed witnesses to the marriage appear to be entirely fictional, created by individuals seeking to profit from sensational stories about the royal family. Freemasonry theories. Another category of conspiracy theories involves the Freemasons, a secretive fraternal organisation that had significant influence in Victorian society. These theories suggest that the Ripper murders were either committed by Freemasons as part of some ritual or were covered up by Masonic influence within the police and government. The Freemasonry theories are typically based on alleged symbolic elements in the murders, such as the positioning of the bodies or the nature of the mutilations, which are claimed to have Masonic significance. Some theorists have also pointed to the fact that several senior police officers and government officials were Freemasons, suggesting that this explains the failure to solve the case. However, these theories suffer from the same lack of credible evidence that characterizes most conspiracy theories. The alleged symbolic elements in the murders can be explained by more mundane factors, and there is no evidence that Freemasonic influence played any role in the investigation or its outcome. The failure to solve the Ripper case can be adequately explained by the limitations of Victorian investigative techniques and the particular challenges presented by the crimes, without the need to invoke conspiracy theories involving secret societies, modern theories and DNA claims. In recent decades, advances in forensic science and the discovery of new documentary evidence have led to the development of new theories about Jack the Ripper's identity. Some of these modern approaches have employed sophisticated analytical techniques, while others have made controversial claims about DNA evidence that allegedly identifies the killer. DNA evidence claims. The most publicized modern claims about Jack the Ripper's identity have involved alleged DNA evidence linking specific suspects to the crimes. These claims have typically focused on items of clothing or other artifacts that are supposed to have been preserved from the crime scenes and that allegedly contain genetic material from the killer. The most prominent of these claims was made by Russell Edwards, who published a book in 2014 claiming that DNA analysis of a shawl belonging to Catherine Eddowes had identified Aaron Kosminski as Jack the Ripper. Edwards claimed that the shawl contained DNA from both Eddowes and Kosminski, providing definitive proof of the latter's guilt. However, these claims have been widely criticized by forensic experts and historians. The provenance of the shawl is questionable, with no clear chain of custody linking it to the original crime scene. The DNA analysis methodology has also been criticized, with experts noting that the techniques used were not sufficient to provide the level of certainty claimed by Edwards. More fundamentally, the possibility of contamination over the 130 years since the murders makes it extremely difficult to obtain reliable DNA evidence from any artifacts that might have survived from the crime scenes. The handling of such items by numerous people over the decades would have introduced multiple sources of genetic material, making it virtually impossible to isolate DNA that could be definitively attributed to the original killer. Psychological profiling, modern criminal profiling techniques have also been applied to the Jack the Ripper case, with profilers attempting to develop psychological portraits of the killer based on the evidence from the crime scenes. These profiles have generally focused on the killer's likely background, personality traits, and behavioral patterns. Most modern profiles suggest that Jack the Ripper was likely a local resident who was familiar with the Whitechapel area, that he probably lived alone or in circumstances that gave him significant freedom of movement, and that he may have had some experience with violence or with handling dead bodies. The escalating nature of the mutilations suggests a killer who was becoming increasingly confident and who may have been driven by compulsive urges that he was unable to control. However, psychological profiling of historical cases faces significant limitations due to the incomplete nature of the available evidence and the differences between Victorian and modern social contexts. The profiles developed by modern experts, while interesting, cannot provide definitive identification of the killer and must be considered speculative. The problem of suspect proliferation. The proliferation of Jack the Ripper suspects reflects both the enduring fascination with the case and the fundamental problem that the lack of conclusive evidence allows almost any theory to be maintained with some degree of plausibility. Each new generation of researchers has brought its own assumptions, methodologies, and concerns to the case, leading to the identification of new suspects who reflect the particular interests and prejudices of their time. The Victorian police focused on suspects who fit their understanding of criminal behaviour and social deviance, but leading them to investigate medical students, foreigners, and individuals with mental health problems. Later researchers have proposed suspects who reflect more modern concerns about social class, political radicalism, and psychological dysfunction. The media attention that the case continues to attract has also contributed to the proliferation of suspects, as authors and filmmakers seek to develop new and sensational theories that will capture public attention. The commercial success of books and documentaries about Jack the Ripper has created incentives for the development of increasingly elaborate and unlikely theories. This proliferation of suspects has made it increasingly difficult to evaluate the relative merits of different theories. The sheer number of proposed candidates, combined with the limited and often contradictory nature of the available evidence, has created a situation where almost any individual who was in London during 1888 could potentially be proposed as Jack the Ripper with some degree of plausibility. The lack of definitive evidence has also allowed confirmation bias to play a significant role in suspect identification. Researchers who become convinced of a particular theory often interpret ambiguous evidence in ways that support their preferred candidate, while dismissing or minimizing evidence that contradicts their theory. Evaluating the evidence. Despite the proliferation of suspects and theories, certain principles can be applied to evaluate the relative merits of different candidates. The most important of these is the requirement for direct evidence linking a suspect to the crimes, such as witness identification, physical evidence from the crime scenes, or contemporary police documentation. By this standard, most of the proposed suspects fail to meet the basic requirements for serious consideration. The vast majority of theories are based on circumstantial evidence, coincidental timing, or speculative psychological profiles that cannot be verified or tested. The suspects who deserve the most serious consideration are those who were actually investigated by the contemporary police and who were considered viable candidates by officers who had direct access to the evidence and witnesses. This would include individuals like Aaron Kosminski, who was mentioned by senior police officers as a serious suspect, and Thomas Cutbush, who was actually detained and investigated in connection with the case. However, even these contemporary suspects cannot be considered proven guilty based on the available evidence. The statements made by police officers years after the murders must be treated with caution, as they may reflect speculation rather than established fact, and the lack of contemporary documentation supporting their claims raises questions about their reliability. The ultimate conclusion must be that, despite more than a century of investigation and speculation, the identity of Jack the Ripper remains unknown. The limitations of Victorian investigative techniques, the passage of time, and the destruction or loss of much of the original evidence make it unlikely that the case will ever be definitively solved, this uncertainty, while frustrating for those who seek closure, is also part of what makes the Jack the Ripper case so enduringly fascinating. The mystery allows each generation to project its own fears, assumptions, and theories onto the case, ensuring that it remains relevant and compelling more than 130 years after the murders were committed. V. The letters and media phenomenon. The Jack the Ripper case marked a watershed moment in the relationship between crime, media, and public consciousness. The murders occurred at a time when mass literacy was expanding, newspaper circulation was growing rapidly, and new printing technologies were making it possible to produce and distribute news more quickly and cheaply than ever before. The result was an unprecedented media phenomenon that not only reported on the crimes, but actively shaped public perception of them, and in many ways created the legend of Jack the Ripper that persists to this day. The media coverage of the Whitechapel murders represented a new form of crime, reporting that combined factual journalism with sensationalism, speculation, and entertainment. This approach proved enormously successful commercially, with newspaper sales reaching record levels during the autumn of 1888. However, it also created significant problems for the police investigation and contributed to a climate of fear and hysteria that had lasting effects on both the local community and British society more broadly. The birth of modern crime reporting, the Jack the Ripper murders, coincided with a revolution in British journalism that was transforming the way news was gathered, produced, and consumed. The abolition of newspaper taxes in the 1850s and 1860s had made it economically viable to produce cheap newspapers aimed at working-class readers, while improvements in printing technology and transportation had made it possible to distribute these papers quickly and widely. By 1888, London had a highly competitive newspaper market that included both established papers like the Times and the Daily Telegraph, and newer publications like the Star and the Pall Mall Gazette that were specifically designed to appeal to mass audiences. These newer papers were characterized by shorter articles, more sensational headlines, and a focus on crime, scandal, and human interest stories that would appeal to readers with limited education and leisure time. The Whitechapel murders provided ideal material for this new style of journalism. The crimes were shocking enough to capture public attention, mysterious enough to sustain interest over an extended period, and occurred in a part of London that was exotic and frightening to middle-class readers. The fact that the victims were prostitutes added an element of sexual scandal that could be exploited while maintaining a veneer of moral outrage. The Star newspaper, which had been founded in 1888 specifically to compete in the mass market, was particularly successful in its coverage of the murders. The paper's sales increased from around 125,000 copies per day before the murders to over 300,000 copies during the height of the panic. This commercial success demonstrated the enormous public appetite for crime news and established patterns of sensationalist reporting that would influence journalism for decades to come. The creation of Jack the Ripper, the name Jack the Ripper, did not emerge from the police investigation or from contemporary analysis of the crimes. Instead, it was created by the media as part of a deliberate strategy to personalize and dramatize the murders. The name first appeared in the Dear Boss letter that was sent to the Central News Agency on September the 27th, 1888, and was subsequently published in newspapers across Britain and around the world. The decision to publish the Dear Boss letter was a crucial moment in the creation of the Jack the Ripper legend. The letter provided the media with a name, a personality, and a voice for the killer, transforming him from an anonymous criminal into a character who could be quoted, analysed and speculated about. The letter's mocking tone and apparent inside knowledge of the crimes created the impression of a killer who was not only brutal, but also intelligent and articulate. The publication of the letter also established a direct communication channel between the supposed killer and the public, mediated by the press. This created a sense of intimacy and immediacy that was unprecedented in crime reporting. Readers felt that they were receiving direct communications from the killer himself, creating a level of engagement and fascination that went far beyond normal news consumption. The name Jack the Ripper itself was perfectly suited to the media's purposes. It was memorable, dramatic, and slightly comic, combining the familiar English name Jack with the violent imagery of Ripper. The name suggested both ordinariness and extraordinariness. A common man who had become a monster, it was also easily adaptable to headlines, cartoons, and other forms of media presentation. The Dear Boss letter and its impact. The Dear Boss letter, received by the Central News Agency on September 27, 1888, represents one of the most significant documents in the Jack the Ripper case, not because of its authenticity. Most experts believe it was a hoax, but because of its enormous impact on public perception and media coverage of the murders. The letter was written in red ink on cheap paper and was addressed to the Boss, Central News Office, London City. The handwriting was described as that of someone with limited education, though the spelling and grammar were generally correct. The tone was mocking and boastful, with the writer claiming responsibility for the murders and threatening to commit more. The most significant aspect of the letter was its apparent prediction of future events. The writer threatened to clip the lady's ears off and send to the police officers just for jolly, a threat that seemed to be fulfilled when Catherine Eddowes was found with her earlobes cut just 3 days after the letter was received. This apparent fulfillment of the letter's prediction convinced many people that it was genuine and that they were indeed reading the words of the killer himself. The Central News Agency's decision to forward the letter to the police and subsequently to publish it was driven by commercial considerations rather than public service. The agency recognized that the letter would generate enormous public interest and would be valuable to newspapers seeking sensational content. The decision to publish was made despite police skepticism about the letter's authenticity and concerns about the impact it might have on the investigation. The publication of the Dear Boss letter had several immediate effects. It provided newspapers with dramatic headlines and content that helped to sell papers. It gave the killer a name and a voice that personalized the crimes, and it established the idea that the murders were the work of a single articulate individual rather than random acts of violence. More significantly, the letter's publication triggered an avalanche of copycat letters that would plague the investigation for months to come. Within days of the Dear Boss letter's publication, police stations, newspaper offices, and other institutions began receiving dozens of similar letters, all purporting to be from Jack the Ripper. By the end of the investigation, police had received over 700 letters claiming to be from the killer, creating an enormous burden for investigators who were required to read and evaluate each one. The Saucy Jackie postcard. The Saucy Jackie postcard, received by the Central News Agency on October 1st, 1888, served as a follow-up to the Dear Boss letter and seemed to provide further evidence of the killer's identity and intentions. The postcard was written in the same hand as the original letter and appeared to reference the double event of September 30th, when both Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were murdered. The postcard's text read, "I was not codding dear old boss. when I gave you the tip, you'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow. Double event this time. Number 1 squealed. A bit couldn't finish straight off. Had not the time to get ears for police. Thanks for keeping last letter back till I got to work again. Jack the Ripper. The reference to the double event was particularly significant because the postcard was postmarked on October 1st, the day after the murders, suggesting that the writer had advanced knowledge of the crimes. The mention of not having time to get ears for police seemed to explain why Elizabeth Stride had not been mutilated in the same way as the other victims, supporting the theory that the killer had been interrupted during the first murder. However, the timing of the postcard also raised questions about its authenticity. The postmark indicated that it had been sent on the morning after the murders, which would have given the writer very little time to learn about the crimes, write the postcard, and post it. This tight timeline led some investigators to suspect that the postcard might have been written by someone with inside knowledge of the investigation, possibly a journalist or police officer. The publication of the Saucy Jackie postcard reinforced the public perception that the letters were genuine communications from the killer. The apparent accuracy of the postcard's predictions and its timely arrival seemed to provide confirmation that the Dear Boss letter had indeed been written by Jack the Ripper himself. The From Hell letter received by George Lusk of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee on October 16, 1888, represented a different type of communication that seemed to provide physical evidence rather than just written claims. The letter was accompanied by half of a human kidney, which the writer claimed to have taken from Catherine Eddowes and partially consumed. The letter was written in a different hand from the Dear Boss letter and postcard, and its tone was more crude and threatening. The text read, "From hell, Mr. Lusk. Saw I send you half the kidney I took from one women pray-sarved it. For you t'other piece I fried and ate it was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out, if you only wait a while longer. Signed, Catch Me When You Can Mr. Lusk." The inclusion of the kidney created a sensation when Lusk made it public. Here, apparently, was physical evidence that connected the letter directly to one of the murders. Medical examination of the kidney revealed that it was human and that it had been removed recently, though experts were unable to determine definitively whether it had come from Catherine Eddowes. The kidney's authenticity became a subject of intense debate among medical experts, police officers, and the press. Some argued that the kidney showed evidence of Bright's disease, a condition that Eddowes was known to have suffered from, suggesting that it had indeed come from her body. Others pointed out that kidneys affected by Bright's disease were readily available from hospital mortuaries and medical schools, making it possible for a hoaxer to have obtained such a specimen. The From Hell letter's crude writing and poor spelling led some experts to conclude that it was more likely to be genuine than the more articulate Dear Boss letter. The argument was that a hoaxer would be more likely to write in an educated style, while the genuine killer might be expected to have limited literacy skills. However, the letter's authenticity remains disputed. The fact that it was sent to George Lusk rather than to the police or press suggested that the writer was familiar with the activities of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, which had been extensively covered in the newspapers. This knowledge could have been acquired by any member of the public who followed the case closely. The hoax letter epidemic. The publication of the Dear Boss letter and the subsequent media attention created what can only be described as a national epidemic of hoax letters. Within days of the original letter's publication, police stations, newspaper offices, government departments, and prominent individuals began receiving letters purporting to be from Jack the Ripper. The scale of this letter-writing campaign was unprecedented in British criminal history. Police records indicate that over 700 letters were received during the course of the investigation, though the actual number may have been much higher as not all letters were preserved or officially recorded. The letters came from all parts of Britain and from overseas, indicating that the Jack the Ripper phenomenon had captured international attention. The hoax letters varied enormously in their content, style, and apparent motivation. Some were obvious jokes or pranks, written by individuals seeking to amuse themselves or their friends. Others appeared to be serious attempts to mislead the investigation or to claim credit for the murders. Still others seemed to be the products of disturbed minds, written by individuals who may have genuinely believed they were Jack the Ripper or who were seeking attention through association with the crimes. The burden that these letters placed on the investigation was enormous. Police were required to read and evaluate each letter, to investigate any specific claims or threats they contained, and to attempt to trace their authors when possible. This diverted significant resources from other aspects of the investigation and created a massive administrative burden for officers who were already stretched thin. The letters also had a significant psychological impact on both the investigation and the public. The constant stream of communications claiming to be from the killer created an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear that made it difficult to distinguish between genuine evidence and hoax material. The letters reinforced the public perception that Jack the Ripper was still active and still communicating with the authorities, maintaining a level of panic and attention that might otherwise have diminished over time. Some of the hoax letters were sophisticated enough to fool even experienced investigators. They included accurate details about the crimes that had not been made public, used medical terminology that suggested anatomical knowledge, or were written in styles that seemed consistent with the supposed characteristics of the killer. These more convincing hoaxes required extensive investigation and analysis before they could be dismissed. The letter epidemic also revealed the extent to which the Jack the Ripper case had captured the public imagination. The fact that hundreds of people were motivated to write letters claiming to be the killer demonstrated the level of fascination and identification that the case had generated. For many letter writers, the act of writing seemed to provide a way of participating in the drama and excitement of the case, even if only through deception, newspaper competition and sensationalism. The Jack the Ripper murders occurred during a period of intense competition among London newspapers, and this competition drove much of the sensationalist coverage that characterised the case. Newspapers competed not only for circulation, but also for exclusive stories, inside information and dramatic headlines that would distinguish them from their rivals. The Star newspaper, which had been founded earlier in 1888, was particularly aggressive in its coverage of the murders. The paper's editor, T.P. O'Connor, recognised that crime stories could drive circulation and devoted extensive resources to covering the Whitechapel murders. The Star's reporters were among the first on the scene of each murder, and the paper often published details and theories that were not available elsewhere. The competition for exclusive stories led newspapers to develop their own sources within the police investigation and the local community. Reporters cultivated relationships with police officers, medical personnel, and local residents who might provide inside information about the crimes and the investigation. This sometimes resulted in the publication of details that the police would have preferred to keep confidential, potentially compromising the investigation. The pressure to produce dramatic headlines and compelling stories also led to the publication of speculation, rumour, and unverified information. Newspapers frequently presented theories about the killer's identity or motives as if they were established facts, and they often sensationalized minor developments in the investigation to create the impression of major breakthroughs. The competitive pressure also encouraged newspapers to take increasingly extreme positions in their coverage. Some papers focused on the social conditions that had created the environment for the murders, using the crimes as a platform for advocating social reform. Others emphasized the exotic and frightening aspects of the East End, portraying it as a foreign and dangerous place that threatened the stability of British society. The international dimension of the newspaper competition added another layer of complexity to the coverage. British newspapers were aware that their stories about Jack the Ripper were being read around the world, and they competed to provide the most dramatic and compelling accounts for international audiences. This international attention further increased the commercial value of Ripper stories and encouraged even more sensationalist coverage. The role of illustration and visual media. The Jack the Ripper case coincided with significant developments in newspaper illustration and visual media that enhanced the impact of the coverage. Improvements in printing technology had made it possible to include detailed illustrations and photographs in newspapers, and publishers recognized that visual elements could significantly increase the appeal of their stories. The murders provided rich material for newspaper illustrators, who created dramatic images of the crime scenes, the victims, and imagined depictions of the killer. These illustrations often took considerable artistic license, portraying the murders in ways that were more dramatic and horrifying than the actual evidence suggested. The images helped to fix certain visual elements of the Jack the Ripper story in the public imagination, including the iconic image of a dark figure stalking through foggy London streets. The use of maps and diagrams was another important visual element in the coverage. Newspapers published detailed maps of the Whitechapel area, showing the locations of the murders, the routes the killer might have taken, and the areas where he might be hiding. These maps helped readers to visualize the geography of the crimes and created a sense of familiarity with the East End that many middle-class readers would never have experienced directly. Photographs were also beginning to play a role in crime reporting, though their use was still limited by technical constraints. The photographs of Mary Jane Kelly's room taken by the police as part of their investigation were among the first crime scene photographs used in a British criminal case. While these photographs were not published in newspapers at the time, their existence was reported, and they contributed to the sense that the case was being documented with unprecedented thoroughness and scientific precision. The visual elements of the coverage helped to create a coherent visual identity for the Jack the Ripper story that transcended individual newspaper accounts. The repeated use of certain images, symbols, and visual motifs helped to establish the case as a distinct cultural phenomenon with its own iconography and mythology. Public reaction and social impact. The media coverage of the Jack the Ripper murders generated an unprecedented level of public interest and engagement that extended far beyond the normal audience for crime news. The combination of sensational reporting, mysterious communications from the supposed killer, and the failure of the police to solve the case created a perfect storm of public fascination that dominated British popular culture during the autumn of 1888. The public reaction to the murders was characterized by a mixture of fear, fascination, and morbid curiosity that reflected the complex relationship between Victorian society and violence. While the murders were universally condemned as horrific crimes, they also provided a form of entertainment that allowed people to experience danger and excitement vicariously while remaining safely removed from the actual violence. The case generated enormous amounts of amateur detective work, with members of the public proposing their own theories about the killer's identity and methods. Letters poured into police stations and newspaper offices from people claiming to have solved the case or offering advice about how the investigation should be conducted. This public participation in the investigation reflected both the democratic spirit of the age and the widespread belief that ordinary citizens could contribute to solving complex problems. The murders also became a topic of conversation in social settings, ranging from working-class pubs to middle-class drawing rooms. The case provided a common reference point that transcended class boundaries, allowing people from different social backgrounds to discuss and debate the same events. This shared cultural experience helped to create a sense of national unity around the case, even as it exposed deep divisions about social conditions and moral values. The commercial exploitation of the case began almost immediately, with entrepreneurs producing Jack the Ripper themed entertainment, souvenirs and publications. Music halls featured songs and sketches about the murders, while publishers rushed out books and pamphlets claiming to reveal the truth about the case. This commercialization of the murders reflected the growing commodification of news and entertainment in late Victorian society. The case also had significant political implications, as it focused attention on the social conditions in the East End and the failure of government institutions to address poverty and inequality. Social reformers used the murders as evidence of the need for improved housing, better policing, and more effective social services. The case thus became a catalyst for broader discussions about social policy and government responsibility. International coverage and impact. The Jack the Ripper murders attracted international attention on a scale that was unprecedented for a British criminal case. Newspapers in Europe, North America, and other parts of the British Empire provided extensive coverage of the murders, often reproducing stories and illustrations from British papers, while adding their own commentary and analysis. The international coverage reflected the growing interconnectedness of the world's media systems and the emergence of news as a global commodity. The development of telegraph networks had made it possible to transmit news stories around the world within hours of their occurrence, while improvements in transportation had facilitated the international distribution of newspapers and magazines. The foreign coverage of the Jack the Ripper case often reflected the particular concerns and prejudices of different national audiences. American newspapers, for example, frequently portrayed the murders as evidence of the decadence and corruption of British society, while European papers sometimes used the case to comment on the problems of urbanization and industrialization that were affecting their own countries. The international attention also contributed to the development of Jack the Ripper as a global cultural phenomenon. The case became a reference point for discussions about crime, violence, and social problems in many different countries, and it influenced the development of crime reporting and popular culture around the world. The global reach of the Jack the Ripper story also had practical implications for the investigation. Police received letters and tips from around the world, including claims that the killer had been seen in various foreign countries. While most of these international leads proved to be false, they demonstrated the extent to which the case had captured global attention and the willingness of people everywhere to participate in the search for the killer, the creation of a cultural icon. The media coverage of the Jack the Ripper murders succeeded in creating something that transcended the original crimes, a cultural icon that has endured for more than a century. The combination of mystery, violence, and social commentary that characterized the original coverage established patterns and themes that continue to influence popular culture today. The figure of Jack the Ripper, as created by the media, embodied many of the anxieties and contradictions of late Victorian society. He was simultaneously a product of urban decay and a threat to civilized order, a figure of working-class violence and a master of middle-class cunning, a local criminal and an international sensation. This complexity and ambiguity have allowed different generations to project their own fears and concerns onto the figure of Jack the Ripper. The media's creation of Jack the Ripper as a personality rather than simply a criminal also established new patterns for crime reporting that continue to influence journalism today. The end. The End of Jack the Ripper, The True Story, a comprehensive factual account of Victorian London's most notorious serial killer. This is the first of many English true crime accounts detailing and analysing their content. Next is Dr. Crippen, a brutal cold-blooded murderer in early 1900s London.